So, a very good day to you all. And it's very wonderful to be here speaking about the Nilgiris. And today I'll be talking about Nilgiris in terms of the interweavings of archaeological and cultural landscapes. So, of course, there are very many rich interweavings of nature and culture, and many of the talks have taken us through some of this. And you're looking here at a spectacular blossoming of the Kurunji or the Nila Kurunji, the Strobilanthus kunthiana. And this flower is also a very rich and ancient cultural motif, which is also reflected in the Tamil Sangam poetry. And the Tamil Sangam poetry refers to the Kurunji flower, which blossoms once in 12 years, and it is found as a metaphor in the Agam genre of love poetry, and is also associated with the girl achieving puberty and so on. So this landscape is also laden with a lot of rich metaphors of this kind. I don't need to introduce you all to all of this, but just to say that the Nilgiri district is also part of a larger biosphere, and the district alone is also home to many indigenous communities, as we all know, Todas, Kotas, Kurumbas, and Baragas. And so it has a very rich and distinctive cultural heritage. And many of these are, of course, gradually getting erased, which we've also been concerned about, and so on. And coming to the antiquity, of course, I'm representing archaeology here, but I should say that I don't come here with all the answers because in a way, although there's been a lot of writing about the Nilgiris in various ways, there's still a lot to be explored in terms of the archaeology, which is also very fascinating. And we're looking here at the rock art site at Velarikombai. And this photograph, as you also mentioned, is I'm grateful to Mr. Kumaravelu of the C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer Foundation, which my cousin Dr. Nandita Krishna had established in the name of my great-grandfather, who was also a very notable presence here in the Nilgiris and had a lot to do with some of the infrastructure like the Paikara Dam and so on. And that foundation has been continuing also some work on documenting and so on. And this photograph is from the rock art site of Velarikombai. And of course, this is amongst the early rock art sites here in southern India. And we also know, of course, of sites such as Erakal in Kerala, which some say go back to the Mesolithic period, but certainly Neolithic and so on. So there's a lot to unpack here. But what is quite interesting also here in Velarikombai is you have these kind of striated lines, a lot of linear lines, and that does to some extent also perhaps recollect to what we're seeing at Erakal and so on, but it's of a different nature. But so this could be seen in terms of these complexes of rock art sites here in southern India. And what is also interesting, of course, is that the local Kurumbas also have a lot of reverence for these rock art sites, and it is called Eruduparai or pictographs. And they also connect these broadly to their ancestors. I was very grateful in my time that my grandparents, the Subbans, who lived quite close to Botanical Garden and, were very well known in the Nilgiris, they would just allow me to ramble about wherever, and many times I wandered around Dorabetta and so on all by myself. And again, there were no bison and so on or anything that I can recollect at that time. But that was also, in a way, what shaped my interests in adventure and archaeology and so on. So I should make a mention of that as well. So as has been mentioned, of course, the Nilgiris is one of the very intensely studied ecosystems going back to the early British and European interests. But what is also perhaps a bit less known is that there's also a very rich rich material culture which has been unearthed in the Nilgiris and which is quite distinctive. And these are associated with numerous cairns and so-called cairns and cromlechs and so on, which had been unearthed in the latter part of the 19th century by Elliots and Breeks and Of course, these were excavated or unearthed perhaps at a time before very systematic archaeological excavation had been established. But they are very important and significant, and they include finds of pottery, iron, and bronze and gold. And in fact, to some extent, because some of those finds, which I'll be touching upon, the metal finds and so on, were so sophisticated that some scholars like Lawrence Leshnik and others have suggested that these may have been imports. But what I would say is that although, of course, one can't dismiss the possibilities of external influences and contacts, from various archaeometallurgical and ethnoarchaeological researches that I've made, I have pointed out that there are significant prospects for local traditions, long-standing local traditions, and also that these fall into what we would broadly call the South Indian Iron Age and megalithic cultures, which of course also extend over a long period of time. And of course, what I'll also point to here is very striking similarities with the materials from the Iron Age burials in Archeological, which were also unearthed by Alexander Ray and so on. And I'll also talked about these very skilled forged heightened bronzes, which are found both at the Nilgiri cairns and the Archeological burials. But of course, we could say that the Nilgiri assemblages could well range over a very wide span of time, because indeed the South Indian megaliths themselves, although we do place them to, let's say, the beginning of about, say, 1000 BC or so, they do continue, I think, into much later times as well, the context of megalithism and erecting memorial stones. And I don't see Professor Paul Hawkins here today, but one of the notable recent excavations was by Paul in the Paikara region, and he also suggested a broad date of about the mid first millennium BC to about 10th century CE. And then, of course, I've also been working with the Tamil Nadu State Department of Archaeology and ASI, where now there are further excavations at Arichanallur and Shivagalai and so on. And for instance, Shivagalai C14 dates have pushed back the dates of the Iron Age burials around the Porunai region to about 1200 BC. So I think there's a lot here to be unpacked, and we do need more systematic archaeology. I've also just begun to be part of a project with Ghent University, the Ghent University Nilgiri Archaeology Project, and my co-investigator is Dr. Daniela Simone. So, but of course, there have been certain challenges in terms of excavations here in the Nilgiris, because many of the places are now in reserve forest areas or part of, the lands of the local people and so on. But anyway, what I will point out too is that some of the artifacts do correlate with other early historic material and certainly fit into the parameters of this material culture, which we call South Indian megalithic or Iron Age early historic, which I suppose loosely can be dated to the early first millennium BC to at least even early medieval period. Now, what you're looking at there is Kodumanal, which is near Erode in Tamil Nadu. And so this is typically a cyst burial site with dolmens, and this is dated to about mid-first millennium BC. And Dr. Rajan, who is doing a lot of work, has at least got dates of about the 5th century BC from Kodumanal. And you see typically these menhir-like stones. And these kind of menhir-like stones you see in quite a lot of places around in the Nilgiris and so on. And in fact, you can also see that the people are quite often also living amongst the menhirs and cromlechs. And for instance, at the far side there, a photograph from one of the Kota villages. And this is Kolimalai. And you can see the temples to Amanor and Aimanor, the Kota gods and goddesses, just behind. And you see again these alignments there of stones, which is typical of what we describe as megalithic. And this seems to demarcate the sacred spaces, so to speak. And at the bottom here again, you see a stone circle near one of the Toda settlements. So in a way, all of these villages are sort of interwoven with some of these remnants, which could go back much earlier. And next to that, you see one of the cairns or the stone circles, which is around Paikara. And of course, around this area is where some of the cairns and cromlechs which were unearthed by Breeks were. And there's also one that had been excavated by Paul Hawkins in that area. So this is typically one of the cairns surrounded by stone circles there. And speaking of the significance, of course, of these stone circles, I think there's a lot that's also quite interesting in terms of how it has been integrated perhaps into the living culture. And for instance, this was a Kurumba painting of Ala Kurumba honey gatherers depicting various stages of honey gathering and so on, with pigments which were made from tree resins and herbs and such like. And this photograph was collected some time back by my husband Digvijay. And you can see that here they're depicted as dancing around these stones, a circle of stones here, and whether that had some kind of significance, which also needs to be captured in terms of the oral histories. And here you also see some of the Kurumba musicians with the oboes and so on. And of course, some of their music is also very evocative of the bees and the gathering of honey, and, the buzzing of the bees and that kind of sound. When we look at this early material culture from the Nilgiris, there are some of these strands which connected to the local flora and fauna. And the slide that you see above is, of course, one of a typical site near one of the Toda settlements. You see the Toda buffalo near one of the Toda huts or Dogle, and this is near Tamaragam. And down below, you see some of the motifs that you typically see in these Toda edifices, which consists of a dressed stone frontage. And quite often it has a kind of what we might describe as bukrania, the bull with the horns, which is again a very ancient motif in a way. And it's also interesting that this terracotta jar with a lid with exactly that kind of buffalo, which could, recall to a Toda buffalo, is also seen in the remnants from the Nilgiri cairns. And this down here is from the government museum in Ooty, and you see that at the bottom is the terracotta jar, and then there's a finial which has an animal figurine, in this case this figurine of a buffalo. And of course, it's quite interesting that this kind of depiction of bukrania is something you also find, for instance, Turkey and Anatolia very early on, but that's also quite an interesting aspect there, I suppose. There's also very interesting tiny metal figurine from Adichanur burials in the Government Museum, Chennai, which also seems to be this kind of depiction of a buffalo, which is very similar to what you see in this terracotta figurine as well. And so that's what I was saying. There are these similarities and resonances between the Adichanur material and the Nilgiri material, which is quite interesting, because that is also actually part of a finial of a metal urn with a kind of finial on top. And of course, this motif, as you know, it finds itself also in the Kotravai figurine in the Pallava era, where you see Kotravai standing on top of, the buffalo head with the horns, which we might describe again as bukrania. Now, so this is, of course, another view of that jar with the lid and the buffalo head. And more typically, of course, you also see some wild animals being depicted, which also points to the fact that we are here in the midst of the forests. And you see here a lidded jar with the terracotta leopard with this tail going right around, which is now in the Government Museum, Chennai. And what is also interesting is that these terracotta urns also have similarities with the metal finds of these kinds of vessels with a lid, and then animal figurines. For instance, in the Adichanur excavation of Ria, you have, again, the similar kind of, the metal bottom and then the finial with the animals and so on. And more recently, there have been a whole lot of urn burials which have been excavated in Adichanur, and you're looking at the far side at some of those. So typically what this miniature urn actually represents is something which is also what you see in these large urns, which also had, skeletons and bones and so on, the base of the urn burial and then the lid and that kind of thing. So that is a motif which seems to endure and seems to find itself in different contexts. And we also know that some of the urns which Breeks was unearthing and so on also yielded the remnants of burnt bones and so on. So this follows these general trends of this South Indian traditions of urn burial. Though, of course, that doesn't preclude the possibility, that the Nilgiri material, how whether it is later or so on, I don't know, all of those need to be unpacked, and probably we need to do TL dating and so on to explore all of this a bit more. But speaking of the pottery, of course, in the Nilgiris, we do have a surviving artisanal community, the Kotas. And this is a traditional Kota woman potter from one of the Kokals in Sholur, one of the Kota villages. And it's also quite interesting that amongst the Kotas, there is this differentiation where it's the women who are the potters and the men exclusively do blacksmithy. So the women, of course, they do work with both handmade and wheel-made pottery. Of course, we don't know when which of those started, but these are some of the handmade remnants here. This is the house of Rajeshwari, one of the senior potters, and so on. And in the tribal museum in the Nilgiris, I found also there's this charming little image of the Kotas actually doing the blacksmiths, but we must remember that this is the women potters who are making a representation of the men at work with blacksmithy. And down below, there is a slide of one of the Kota blacksmiths, Mr. Kollan, along with the Kota priest. And this is one of the blacksmiths' workshops. And of course, Paul Hawkins has also written about this aspect that the Kotas in the past were also said to have been gold and silver smiths as well, although these days they only do blacksmithy. So these are some of the cairns and stone circles near Paikara. And what we also found on some recent trips there is a lot of slag scattered around on the way leading up to this particular cairn. This is metallurgical slag from iron smelting. I didn't have time to put in some of the slides of the arrowheads and so on from the Nilgiri cairns. Many of them are in the British Museum, who've also uploaded some of those photographs and so on. But what was interesting was that there were these slags. Now, Paul has, of course, written about the fact that when John Sullivan came to the Nilgiris, he actually, he claims that the Kotas were not doing their own iron smelting. By that time, they were collecting scrap and doing iron smelting. So that could, of course, be the case in more recent times. But the fact is that these slags are not actually found near the Kota settlements, but they're found very close to the cairns, and they're not near a settlement in that sense. So it's possible, or it's at least an interesting possibility, that these are just lying around from much earlier times and could be part of some of the local, traditions going back into antiquity. And this was just to say that we've done some X-ray fluorescence analysis. Of course, X-ray fluorescence is a surface technique. So in this case, this is more qualitative, just pointing out that this is iron slag. And this is the waste from the smelting of iron, which is a solid state process. And then the slag, which is the liquid waste containing some of the siliceous materials from the ore and so on, drains out of the furnace. But clearly there would have been some local iron ore and so on for the smelting activity. So now I come to some of these finds, because what is also probably not very well known is that the Nilgiris actually is one of the find spots of some of the most spectacular surviving examples of early Indian gold jewelry from anywhere in the subcontinent. Of course, they're now in the British Museum. And I think they've also been, at least some examples are now up on display, but for a long time they were in the stores. And I'm grateful also to Richard Blurton, who was then the curator, who had showed me some of these Nilgiri artifacts. And so on the top, you're seeing a very beautiful example of one of the earrings, which has this floral motif, kind of pointed petals and so on. It also shows evidence of what we describe as granulation, where granulation is a technique where very, very small spherules of gold were formed. And then, of course, they've been attached onto this to form this motif. So it's got both filigree and granulation there. And of course, this granulation technique it's also found in other examples of early historic gold jewelry, also from South India. For instance, there's a spectacular example from Sutakeni, which was a site excavated by French teams, and that material is now in the Musée Guimet in Paris. And this is a floral motif from Sutakeni where you have this kind of these bits which remind you of a prickly fruit, but you can also see very fine small gold spherules, granulation again being used there. And I've also put on the far side, that's a earring from Taxila of the 1st century, from the Bir Mound excavations, which is, of course, now in Pakistan, the Gandharan period. And you also see the prominent use of granulation there. Now, it's interesting, of course, that it's normally said that the granulation technique is something which came with the Hellenistic world, or the Hellenistic influences, and that it also, Etruscan and Hellenistic. And that is, of course, certainly a possibility. And we also know that there were a lot of Hellenistic interactions here in southern India. But what is also very interesting is that you find these gold microbreeds also from the Nilgiri cairns, which are now in the British Museum, what you see up there. And these gold microbeads are something which are very distinctive and found very early on already in the Indian subcontinent, which is from Mohenjo-daro, the IVC culture. You can see there, there's the set of microbeads, which is in the National Museum, dated to about 2500 BC. And you already see here this very marked use of microbeads. So it's, one needn't necessarily say that they didn't know how to make these spherules of golds and so on. So where the influence was coming from is hard to say. And what's also interesting is more recently, the Kiradi excavations from the 6th century BC near Madurai has also yielded these kind of gold ornaments with floral motifs and repoussé and so on. So it could be broadly also part of what was going on in the early South Indian and Tamil culture. And you also find the microbead also in Kiradi. And it's also interesting, of course, at Kiradi, there has been some discussion of the possible echoes or connections with the IVC cultures also, because you're seeing remnants of pavements, and there are a few graffiti signs also on the pottery and so on, which may recall to Indus signs. So I think this is, an interesting possibility here also, whether these microbeads were part of something which has come also via that route, some legacy of IVC, I don't know. So all of this to unpack, but I'm just putting some of these ideas ahead. And of course, what is interesting is that the Nilgiri region has also had old gold deposits, which, of course, in today's times, they're uneconomical, but in antiquity, they would probably have been viable. And so it's quite likely that the gold was local. Of course, we do need to do some more of the analyses and so on to unpack that. And this was one of the old gold workings in the Gudalur area, which we had visited. And it's also interesting that one of the accounts of the Roman Pliny mentioned gold from the Naris. And it has been thought that this Naris may refer to the regions bordering Kerala, the regions associated with the NIAS. And in fact, there is also a Tamil Sangam reference to a merchant, a gold merchant from, that sort of region, which we could possibly associate with the Wayanad region, because Gudalur borders over to Wayanads, and from these auriferous, hilly deposits, the gold gets washed down in the alluvial streams, and then it finds its way down into the Wayanad. And there are various other references. For instance, the district gazetteer also mentions some mining in the time of Tipu Sultan. And we also know that the British were also prospecting here for gold. And it's also interesting that Seville, for instance, also mentions that the local Kurumbas, the Beta Kurumbas, were also involved in extracting gold. And when we had made this field trip to one of the streams close to the Gudalur area, you see here that these are just Kurumba children, who, of course, some years ago, and we were also there thanks to support from Stan and Marie Thekekara. And you can see here that they use a pan, and the heavier gold sort of goes down, and the lighter elements get washed away. But also what's interesting is that now these deposits are completely uneconomical. But even the most minute amount of gold, though it's all done illegally, that has a lot of value for them because it becomes some sort of income for them. And they use the mercury amalgamation technique for the extraction of gold, where they mix up some mercury amalgam along with this material which is there in the pans. And so the mercury forms an amalgam with the gold and settles in the bottom. And as you can see here, this child has collected, even though it's a small blob, he's collected that on this leaf. And then he burns the leaf out. And so once the leaf burns, the mercury sublimates and then the gold is retrieved. And it's just really, really tiny amounts, but even that, is important for them, and it's a source of income for them. And this is also one of the unfortunate aspects that some of the traditional livelihoods probably that they may have been engaged in, thanks to the various acts of making, mining illegal or the Forest Act and so many of these things, many of the communities that depended on the local resources for their livelihoods have had to lose those. We've also seen that in the Telangana area, for instance, where there was a lot of early wood steel, production and mining from the forest. But the Forest Act meant that the local the local iron smelting communities and the Kamaris had to give up those practices and such like. Now I'll come to the very intriguing Nilgiri heightened bronze bowls that I had mentioned, and for that I'll have to just give you a little bit of metallurgical context so you appreciate what I'm saying. So some of my early work was also on the analysis of the Chola bronzes, which of course I won't be talking upon here. But just to tell you that these, the Chola bronzes, of course, and you're looking at a very beautiful example of Parvati in the Government Museum, Chennai. This is 10th century. And these were made by alloying copper and a little bit of tin and lead. Now, the tin in these kinds of bronzes was a bit on the low side. And so typically the microstructure or the metallic structure that you see of this bronze is what we call a low-leaded tin bronze. And in general, it's been, I think most people just think of the Chola bronzes that this was a brilliant phase of Indian, or South Indian metallurgy, and that's the end of the story. But what has really not been talked about is these very astonishing heightened bronzes. And just to tell you what I'm talking about, if you look at this phase diagram here, so the low tin bronze that I was talking about has tin which is less than about 15%. And these are, the cast bronzes. And the reason why the tin did not exceed 15% is because a higher amount of tin makes bronze very brittle. But what is very remarkable is that even in these Nilgiri vessels, you find that they were going very specifically for this composition of 23% tin bronze, which is gives a very special alloy called beta bronze. 23% tin bronze has certain properties, which is although this alloy is very brittle, at very high temperatures, it can be worked very extensively. And then when the bronze is quenched, that particular phase, the beta phase, martensitic beta phase, is retained. And it gives some very good properties. It makes the bronze less brittle, as you were seeing in this Thai bronze here, which had just cast 23% in bronze. The hands are broken off. Whereas the forged and quenched beta bronzes with 23% tin, they actually can be forged to very extensive thinnesses, as you're seeing in this Adichinur vessel and in this Nilgiri vessel. And this is another example of a heightened bronze vessel from the Nilgiri cairns, which is again forged, and there are these rings and such like. And so what I was able to establish is that there's still a continuing tradition where they still make vessels of this kind, for instance, in Kerala, and this was spread over other parts of Tamil Nadu. This is a contemporary one made in Palakkad. And you see that microstructure of the elongated needles of beta phase and the needles of alpha phase, that's exactly the same as what you're finding in the Nilgiri vessel. So this is a very long-standing tradition. And just to take you through some of the steps where it is hot forged extensively and then quenched. And then when it is polished, it takes on this very brilliant sort of color. And these are some of these Nilgiri vessels. And what I also saw in Kerala was that they're still making these fine rings and things like that. And you see this knob-based vessel And you also see these lotus motifs and such like on these vessels. So this was very much a technology which is still surviving in the context of southern India. Whether these were being made, say, in places like Kerala or Tamil Nadu and then coming up from the Palghat Pass, or made here locally, of course, that we can't say. But there are also an interesting aspect that the Todas, actually, I find they still hoard these kinds of vessels. This is in the home of the Toda priest Singaraju, who very kindly showed some of these vessels. And again, that brilliant luster which comes from polishing this heightened bronze very extensively. Now, what is also very interesting is that it had been argued that these beta bronzes might have been imported because you do find 20% in bronze also in all the way across in Thailand. For instance, there's a site of the 4th century Bandontapet, which has, of course, yielded more of these examples than any other. And in fact, my late supervisor, Dr. Ian Glover, had worked on those. And Bandontapet is one of those well-dated sites of about 4th century BC. But what we find is that these vessels of Adichinallur and Nilgiris and so on, they're extensively hot forged and quenched with very extensive formation of beta martensitic needles. Whereas the Thai examples are just very lightly cast and quenched. So they hadn't actually quite exploited the properties of beta phase in that way, in quite the same way as the Nilgiri and Archur vessels, which are probably the best examples of really heavily hot forged heightened bronzes that you can find anywhere in antiquity. And there are these very interesting similarities. For instance, you find a terracotta cock in the Nilgiri cairns. There's also a cock from Bandontapet, and the cock also from Adichinallur. And it's also associated with Tamil Sangam literature. So one could say that there is a possibility that this was a tradition that was more widespread. And I've also found now more examples, and that it could have actually spread also from India to Southeast Asia. It's not necessarily the case that there was more tin in Southeast Asia, and hence these proceeded. I've tried to point out that there are in fact earlier examples which I won't go into here because the talk will go on endlessly. I just have 2 more slides which I just wanted to put, not to say that this is anything very, this is just speculative, but then, so much speculation is made of all kinds, so why not this too? But it's very intriguing because there's this terracotta that I saw in the BM collection where you have this bearded figure with a diadem. And, there are these very distant echoes, whether this is just coincidental or whatever. For instance, in the bearded priest king with the diadem. And you see there, of course, this presence of the diadem also in the Iron Age megalithic and so on. So these are very tenuous. And finally, also this very intriguing, only to say that some of these archaic modes perhaps have survived in some ways in some pockets. I don't know what the significance is or whether it's really meaningful. But anyway, for instance, the Mohenjo-daro dancing girl with the hair to the side. And the kolkot is something that you also see amongst the Kota women, the side bun. And that's another figurine from the Iron Age, from the Nilgiri cairns, which, it does recollect a bit to this motif of the mother goddess. But then, of course, any figurine, I guess, would look the same. But that did have the mother goddess terracottas, which you also find in the Neolithic. And, the Neolithic, of course, Harappan mother goddess terracottas also go back to a larger tradition of Neolithic mother goddess figurines that you find elsewhere in antiquity, in Europe and so on. It has also been speculated that, because these are clearly representations of women, and whether there were any women who actually, made these, or were the women also the potters, because there are, there was such striking artifacts of early antiquity, in many parts of the world. And, here you do have this example of the Kota women who are still the potters, which is quite an extraordinary aspect. And in a way, the Marit has made a very nice, article in our book on the Kotas, where she says that actually they should be treated as a living treasure too, because they're one of the few artisanal communities of potters and so on. So there's a lot here in the Nilgiris to be cherished and so on. So this is, of course, the hero stone from Varathotam with the, another wave of communities going up from the Mysore region and all, which has also been mentioned. So thank you. Yeah, actually, I've done some work on some production sites also from other parts of Tamil Nadu, for instance, Melsiruvalur, where you actually find in the crucibles remnants of hypereutectoid steel. So that was clearly being used for making this high carbon steel, yes, where you carburize wrought iron in these crucibles and get about 1.2% of carbon, which gives these very good properties, which makes the steel very ductile as well, because it's a particular kind of alloy which can take a lot of forging at high temperatures. So, and then we had also done some work on Telangana, but now actually even at Kodumanal, of course I didn't put it in here, Kodumanal also seems to be giving some evidence of high carbon steel. Though of course I'm in the process of publishing it, and of course Dr. Rajan's work had also been suggesting. So we are getting some pretty early examples in the South Indian context. And in fact, the term ukku also, which then is what becomes woods.
Yes.
But ukku itself, it's derived from a Tamil word, urukku. And in fact, when you talk to many traditional, like in Kerala and even Tamil Nadu, they still use that term urukku when they're describing the melting of metals and things like that. So I think it was obviously a very, a tradition that was quite well established here. About the reconstruction, yes, I think that kind of work has been done much more in the West, like by Verhoeven and so on. But, to get to that point of reconstruction, we first need to understand what is there in the archaeology and, do the analysis and so on, and have the time to publish everything, because I just find that's an impossible task. And also get the access to the analytical equipment. It's not that trivial. So I think these are incremental steps, but, we are getting there.